The room buzzed with quiet intensity. Lights shimmered over polished wood. Flags framed the backdrop. This wasn't just any panel, it was the Global Values Forum in Washington, D.C., where world leaders sat not to fight wars, but to sell ideas. On stage sat Robert F. Kennedy Jr., confident, calm, smiling at the crowd. His name drew applause. His last name, even more. Ibrahim Traoré, by contrast, sat quietly. No teleprompter. No notes. Just a leather-bound notebook on his lap and the weight of millions behind his stillness. Cameras were already fixated on him. Not because he looked uncomfortable, but because he didn't. Kennedy leaned into the microphone, voice smooth with conviction. America's founding promise, he began, wasn't perfect, but it was powerful. We strive. We learn. We grow. And at our best, he paused with timing, we fight for equality. Because at the core, we're all equal. Applause. Then silence. Because Traoré didn't clap. He simply looked up. The moderator shifted. Kennedy turned, slightly puzzled. President Traoré, the host said with a polite nod, how does your nation view this vision of global equality? Traoré's fingers curled around his pen before he spoke. Calm. Low. Deadly clear. You say we're all equal, he said slowly, eyes locked on Kennedy. But in whose world? A flicker of tension. Kennedy kept smiling, but it tightened. Traoré continued. You fund institutions that speak of human rights, while drone strikes still haunt my region. You hold summits on fairness, but block access to medicine. You sign declarations of peace, while selling arms to our neighbors. He looked directly into the crowd now. You preach equality. And maybe you believe it. Then, slowly, deliberately, he added, but let's be honest, most of that equality only exists, on paper. Gasps. Audible shifts in the audience. Even Kennedy blinked, unsure if he'd been insulted or indicted. Traoré leaned back in his chair. Not angry. Not performative. Just done with illusions. And suddenly, the panel wasn't about policy anymore. It was about truth. For a moment, Kennedy didn't speak. The applause he was used to didn't come this time. Instead, the silence pressed on his shoulders. He adjusted his tie, clearing his throat as though that could reset the moment. Well, he finally began, we can't fix history overnight. But we must believe in progress. That's what equality means, it's a goal, a direction, not a destination. He smiled again. But it was different now, strained. The crowd gave him polite nods, but their eyes kept drifting to the man who had just cracked open the stage without raising his voice. Traoré didn't interrupt. He just watched. The same way someone watches a man talk about rain from a dry balcony while others drown below. Kennedy went on, this time faster, America has sacrificed blood and treasure to defend freedom. We don't always get it right, but we never stop trying. That was the moment Traoré shifted forward in his seat. The movement alone stole the air from the room. Trying, he echoed. Trying is not enough when you hold the pen and we bleed the ink. Kennedy tilted his head. Excuse me? Traoré spoke with measured calm. Your trying sends drones into wedding tents. Your trying funds NGOs that destabilize our youth. Your trying comes with strings, always. Now even the moderator tensed. Let's keep this civil, gentlemen. It is civil, Traoré said flatly. I haven't raised my voice. But I won't raise your illusions either. A low murmur rippled through the room. Phones were out. Viewers were already cutting clips for social media. Kennedy tried again. So what would you propose? That we stop engaging entirely? No, Traoré said, eyes like steel. I'm asking that you start listening with both ears. Not just the one that flatters you. That line hit hard. Someone in the back muttered, "Damn." Kennedy blinked, clearly thrown. He was used to opposition. But this wasn't just opposition, it was conviction. And for the first time that evening, the American politician with the legacy name didn't look like the anchor in the conversation. He looked like the one trying to catch up. Something subtle had changed in the room. The energy no longer orbited Kennedy's legacy or the grandeur of the venue. It followed Traoré, calm, unflinching, grounded like a tree that had survived storms no one in that room could name. The moderator, clearly uneasy, glanced at her notes. "Let's shift slightly," she said, her voice tense. "President Traoré, critics say your leadership style is confrontational. That you reject international cooperation." Traoré didn't blink. "Cooperation isn't what's being offered. Submission is." A few gasps. Kennedy stiffened. "I don't reject collaboration," Traoré added. "I reject masks. Don't call it aid when you demand obedience. Don't call it democracy when only your model is allowed." Kennedy interjected. "But without shared values, we risk chaos." Traoré looked at him and said, "The chaos was born from your values." Now the room froze. It was no longer about policy nuance, it was about worldview, history, and power. "Let me be clear," Traoré continued. "We are not here to burn bridges. We are here to expose who keeps owning the bridge, charging us to cross, and then lecturing us on independence." A burst of spontaneous applause erupted, from unexpected corners of the audience. Students. Young diplomats. Journalists. People tired of polished speeches that meant nothing. Kennedy leaned into the microphone, trying to reclaim footing. "You speak in metaphors. But leadership is about responsibility. Without stability, we all fall. And stability," Traoré replied, "is often your excuse for stagnation. We've been stable under your boots for decades. That's not peace, it's pressure." The moderator tried to steer the panel elsewhere. "Maybe we should move to climate cooperation." But Traoré raised a single hand, not aggressively, but with enough confidence that the entire room quieted. He didn't need volume. He had clarity. And for the first time, it wasn't just African delegates nodding with him. Even Western attendees, some of them, were leaning in. Listening. Questioning their own applause cues. Traoré hadn't come to win a debate. He had come to unmask the language of equality, and return it to those who had never felt it. The rhythm of the event had broken. This was no longer the polished forum Kennedy had entered with confidence. The air was thick now, not with aggression, but with awareness. People weren't just listening to Traoré, they were questioning what they believed before he spoke. Kennedy felt it. His team in the front row shifted nervously. One staffer was already tapping her phone, likely preparing a statement just in case this moment spun viral. Because it was spinning. "I think we need context," Kennedy said sharply, interrupting the silence. "This isn't a blame game. It's a dialogue." "Dialogue?" Traoré repeated, leaning slightly forward. "A dialogue requires two things, speech and the courage to hear." Kennedy opened his hands. "I'm listening now." "No," Traoré said plainly. "You're preparing your rebuttal. That's not listening. That's defense disguised as diplomacy." The room stirred again. Kennedy shot back, "You accuse the West of dominance. But without us, without our investment, many of your countries wouldn't have running water or electricity." There it was. The mask dropped. And Traoré didn't flinch. Didn't raise his voice. He just smiled, not with joy, but with recognition. "You just proved my point," he said. Kennedy hesitated. "You don't offer partnership," Traoré continued, you offer paternalism. You give, then dangle it over our heads. Your charity is always a leash. The moderator whispered into her earpiece. The producers backstage were likely panicking. And yet, no one left. Because even those uncomfortable knew something real was happening. Kennedy crossed his arms. So what's your solution, then? Walk away from the world? Turn inward? Traoré's gaze was steady. No. I say meet the world as equals, not as beggars, not as pawns. We don't reject unity. We reject terms that hide control beneath kindness. That line broke something open. Students clapped first. Then came the analysts. Even a few ambassadors joined. Kennedy looked around, his face not angry now, but stunned. For the first time in the conversation, he realized something brutal. He wasn't the center anymore. Kennedy leaned back, the lights above him suddenly feeling hotter than before. He wasn't sweating, but he might as well have been. For a man raised in rooms where applause was inherited, this moment was foreign. He wasn't used to silence, especially after speaking. Traoré sat in that silence with ease. Kennedy adjusted the mic. President Traoré, you seem to believe America is the villain in every story. Traoré looked at him for a moment, then said, no. A pause. I believe you've cast yourselves as the hero for so long, you've forgotten other people even have stories. The audience was hooked now, not in outrage, but in curiosity. A truth had surfaced that wasn't going back under. Kennedy tried to redirect. I've been to your region. I've seen poverty, instability, schools without roofs. And yet you walk away with speeches, Traoré said sharply. Not solutions. You document the suffering like tourists with cameras, then leave with policy papers. That is not solidarity. That is performance. A flicker of embarrassment crossed Kennedy's face. He wasn't used to being told this. Not like this. And not in front of this kind of audience. You speak of equality, Traoré continued, but your systems ensure we remain consumers, not competitors. You export lectures and import minerals. You sell leadership and buy silence. Kennedy looked to the moderator, but she didn't step in. It was too late to shift course. Traoré leaned forward now, just slightly. Equality isn't a slogan. It's a seat at the table. And we've learned something, you don't give those seats. We have to build our own tables. That line dropped like thunder. A journalist in the front row tapped furiously. Another lifted her phone. The forum wasn't just a discussion anymore, it was history on camera. Kennedy, ever the orator, tried once more. But democracy, freedom, these are values we've all fought for. Traoré nodded. Yes. But when they are selectively applied, they become weapons. Not principles. And that's when a few in the audience stood. Not many. Just a handful. But they stood. And the message was clear. The conversation had changed. The moderator's earpiece buzzed again, this time more urgently. Producers backstage were panicking. The program had veered far from its safe scripted segments. But no one dared cut it. Because something bigger was unfolding, something raw, unplanned, and undeniably real. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a man who had made a career of rhetoric, now found himself cornered, not by aggression, but by precision. Traoré hadn't raised his voice once. And yet every sentence landed like it had been sharpened for years. I'll admit, Kennedy said carefully, you speak with passion. But passion isn't policy. Change needs structure, not just speeches. Traoré's answer came without hesitation. And structure without soul is why your systems collapse in countries you claim to help. Kennedy flinched. Traoré continued, you build embassies before hospitals. You fund elections before clean water. Then you ask why people don't trust democracy. It's because they've seen what your version costs. This time, the applause wasn't just scattered, it was sustained. A senator in the third row whispered something to his aide. A European delegate folded his arms, uneasy. And a CNN anchor leaned toward her producer and whispered, "This is going to go viral tonight." Kennedy tried to reframe. "So are we enemies now, President Traoré?" "No," Traoré replied. "Enemies are clear about their intentions. What we face is more dangerous, friendships built on imbalance." The room absorbed the line like a punch to the chest. He wasn't talking just about America. He was talking about an entire system of global relationships dressed in equality, but steeped in hierarchy. Kennedy's frustration was now visible. "You're painting with a broad brush." "I'm painting what we've lived," Traoré said simply. The moderator cleared her throat. "We're nearing the close of this panel." But no one moved. No one looked at the clock. Because for once, the truth was louder than the format. Traoré didn't gloat. He didn't grandstand. He simply looked at Kennedy and said, "You call it global leadership. We've learned to call it what it truly is, global choreography. And we're tired of dancing to your rhythm." Kennedy sat back, the weight of his own name suddenly heavier than ever. For decades, being a Kennedy meant instant reverence, a shorthand for gravitas, legacy, purpose. But here, in front of a man who owed no one his voice, legacy meant little. And gravitas could not compete with truth. Traoré wasn't performing. He was exposing. The moderator glanced anxiously at her notes. "One final question to both of you, what does global leadership look like in the next decade?" Kennedy answered first. His tone had changed, softer now, more measured. "It looks like nations working together. Like compromise, like courage. We may not always agree, but we must stay at the table." He paused. "Because the world is too fragile to walk away." It was a solid answer. Safe. Rehearsed. It would look good in headlines. But then came Traoré. "Leadership," he said quietly, "is not about staying at a table you were never allowed to build. It's about knowing when to build your own." No applause yet. He went on. "We've seen leadership dressed in medals and missions. But real leadership doesn't colonize with contracts. It doesn't manipulate with aid. It doesn't preach while poisoning." Now the applause began again, slow but rising. "In the next decade," Traoré continued, "global leadership will belong to those who listen without entitlement and speak without fear. And above all, it will belong to those who understand that equality isn't a slogan to brand. It's a structure to build." That broke the silence. Standing ovations came, this time wider, deeper. Some clapped reluctantly. But many clapped with their whole bodies. Because for the first time that evening, the word equal felt less like a dream, and more like a demand. Kennedy's smile had faded completely. He wasn't angry. He was learning, maybe for the first time in a long while, what it felt like to stand in a room that no longer bent around him. The moderator stood. "Thank you, gentlemen." But the applause drowned her out. Because the crowd had already decided. One of them spoke to history. The other one was still quoting it. By now, even those who had arrived to champion Kennedy knew the shift had happened. This was no longer a forum, it was a reckoning. And at the center stood Ibrahim Traoré, not with bluster or bombast, but with a quiet fury sharpened by lived experience. Kennedy, to his credit, didn't walk out. But the glint of control he once held had dulled. He now looked more like a spectator in a room he thought he owned. The moderator turned to Traoré. "President, one final thought for the young people watching tonight?" Traoré didn't hesitate. "Do not mistake politeness for progress," he said. "And never confuse polished speeches with justice. The world isn't changed by those who inherit microphones, it's changed by those who speak even when they're not handed one. The room froze. Then erupted. This wasn't applause out of politeness, it was visceral. It was people standing because their spine told them to, not etiquette. Kennedy watched, unmoving. Traoré turned slightly toward him now, voice steady. Mr. Kennedy, your country taught the world how to brand freedom. We're here to remind the world how to practice it. The light seemed to dim around Kennedy in that moment, not literally, but in presence. He nodded. Once. Quietly. I may not agree with everything you've said, Kennedy replied, but I've heard you. Traoré didn't return the gesture. He simply looked out into the crowd. Then remember this, he said. And his voice dropped just enough to make the whole room lean in. Real power is not being heard. It's making others listen, when they didn't plan to. No applause this time. Just silence. Heavy, thoughtful, reshaping. The moderator, visibly moved, finally spoke. We thank both speakers for their candor. But she didn't need to finish. The story was already out of her hands. This debate, meant to showcase political nuance, had instead revealed something deeper. The global order wasn't just shifting. It was being questioned, loudly, publicly, and with no permission asked. The crowd eventually dispersed, but something had lingered in the air, something heavier than applause, more lasting than a headline. A shift. Not just in opinion, but in orientation. In the media tent outside, reporters scrambled to reframe their narratives. What was supposed to be a polite diplomatic dialogue had become a clash between comfort and confrontation. And the buzzwords they'd come armed with, partnership, shared values, Western leadership, suddenly felt dated. Kennedy was escorted out through a side door. He nodded to his aides, waved half-heartedly to a few lingering supporters, but there was no triumph in his stride. Because for the first time in years, he wasn't the voice that mattered most in the room. Back inside, Traoré remained. Students clustered near him. Not with worship, but with urgency. Young leaders from Latin America, Asia, and Africa took turns asking questions, not about charity, but about agency. Not, how can we get help, but, how do we stop needing it? That was the legacy forming in real time, not just a moment, but a blueprint. One journalist approached Traoré quietly. Mr. President, do you think you embarrassed the United States tonight? Traoré didn't blink. If truth embarrasses you, he said, you're not ready for change. Then he walked past the cameras, not toward the exit, but toward the students. The future. At the same time, in a private green room nearby, Kennedy sat alone with his thoughts. A coffee untouched. A screen showing replays of the forum, Traoré's soundbites already trending worldwide. One aide finally spoke. Do you want us to issue a rebuttal? Kennedy shook his head. No. Let them watch it. He stood slowly, straightened his tie, and added, almost to himself. Maybe it's our turn to listen for once. Outside, in the cool air of a shifting world, the echo of Traoré's words continued, not as noise, but as a quiet revolution. Only on paper. The clip spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, Traoré's responses were subtitled in 12 languages. Hashtags surged across platforms, hashtag only on paper, hashtag Traoré versus Kennedy, hashtag global reckoning. TikTok wasn't filled with dances this time, it was filled with declarations. A new generation had just found its voice. And they weren't quoting Kennedy. They were quoting Traoré. Universities held watch parties. Professors rewrote lectures. And across boardrooms and briefing rooms in Washington, Brussels, and Paris, one question echoed. Who let him speak like that? But no one had let him. He took the mic. And never gave it back. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, a classroom full of students watched the debate on a projector. At the end, they didn't cheer. They nodded. Because what the world heard as shock, they had known for years. Their president wasn't performing for the West. He was reclaiming space for the rest. In New York, Kennedy addressed a quiet press gathering 2 days later. He didn't insult Traoré. He didn't spin. He simply said, "We were raised to believe equality is inherited. But I was reminded that it must be earned. And earned again. And earned by all." He stepped away without taking questions. And that, in its own way, was a beginning. Traoré, when asked for comment, simply said, "History doesn't change when you speak softly. It changes when you speak when you're not supposed to." No podium. No flag behind him. Just a gravel path, a village market, and the sound of people building something that looked a lot more like equality than anything Kennedy had put on paper. They called it a debate. But what we witnessed was something else. When Robert F. Kennedy Jr. said, "We're all equal," he expected agreement. Respect. Silence. Instead, he got Ibrahim Traoré. And Traoré didn't shout. He didn't posture. He spoke the kind of truth that doesn't ask for applause. It commands it. Because equality isn't something you declare in speeches. It's something you live, every day, in every policy, in every act of power. And when Kennedy tried to wrap his ideals in paper, Traoré lit that paper with fire. The fire of lived experience, stolen futures, and rising voices. This wasn't about left or right. It wasn't about America or Africa. It was about who gets to define justice. And who's finally refusing to wait for it. So next time someone says, "We're all equal," just remember. It only counts when it's more than words. Because paper burns. But truth doesn't.